Very much welcome to this session, which is all going to be about electric vehicles. So I'm going to call to the stage now our panel. If you give them a round of applause. We've got Philip New, who's the CEO of Energy Systems Catapult, Laura Rainey, Senior Project Manager of EVs at the National Grid, David Heitch, Head of Innovation and Strategy at Franklin Energy, and Ross Fairley, Partner, Burgess Salmon Lawyers, who's expert in renewables. We've got a lot of expertise here in the on-the-ground infrastructure to charge your car, and also in that bigger picture stuff about is there enough energy in the country to cope with electric cars. I think it's what some of the myths we're going to debunk is what we've called this session, because I think a lot of people have very strong views about electric vehicles, and actually a lot of those myths are starting to become a bit old now, I think. So everyone's going to have a little sort of time at the start just to sort of make their pitch and introduce it, and then we're going to get to the panel discussion. We've been using Slido this year. It's actually worked really well. So there's a shock for technology, but it's so you go onto the Slido app if you haven't downloaded it, and then the hashtag you need to put in is that one there, HWYSUK. It's really simple. There's not lots of form filling to do. You just go download the app and put that in, and then put in a question, and I will get those on my phone, and they'll also come up on the monitor here as well. And I'll try and ask as many as I can. I mean, if you want to go old school, analog, and just put your hand up and ask a question, we can get a microphone to you as well. Feel free, but Slido's been working really, really well. But anyway, welcome to you guys. We're going to start off with David.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Heitch. My background is significantly in transport, and it started out in ticketing and so forth. But the context for this session this morning was me getting a little bit angry at listening to people talking about all the reasons why EVs would never become part of our normal life, whether it was to do with the range, whether it was to do with speed, whether it was to do with the time it took to charge things, the fact that charge posts quite often are unavailable, either because they're broken or because at best another EV is parked there charging or not charging because it's already full, or indeed the expression iced is coming into play, where you have a vehicle which is non-EV occupying an EV space. So all of those factors are relatively well exercised, both in the media as well as in pub conversations. So I wanted to try and put a situation forward which actually deals with those things and explains why today the EV charging infrastructure that is being rolled out pretty rapidly at the moment is more than able to support the growth in EVs and the development of EV technology. We're also, have to say, very fortunate that it isn't just about the front-end technology of charging points. It is about the systems that support those, and also the energy factors and the distribution of energy, which is why we've been fortunate to get Laura and Philip and Ross here to cover off those aspects as well, because I know everybody is very concerned, much as at the end of the 100 meters Olympic race, when everybody rushes to the kitchen, puts on their kettles and the whole grid fails. They're concerned that when everybody gets home at lucky people at 7 o'clock at night, they'll plug their cars in, and that'll completely black out half of Birmingham because the grid can't cope. So that's the sort of background. From my perspective, I was involved in the initial rollout of EV charging in Greater Manchester in the early days of OLEV and getting grants forward. You might imagine that it was a little bit of an uphill struggle persuading local councillors to support a scheme where there were at that time, I think, 35 EVs registered in Greater Manchester, to spend considerable sums of money putting in this technology on the basis that it would be useful and it would be something that we needed to do. Initially, obviously the EV take-up has been relatively slow. The lessons learned in that first round showed that in some ways it was too soon. In other ways, it was good that we actually got on and did something. And were able to learn lessons. The lessons we learned, or at least the lessons I've learned, are that charge points, in a sense, are a little bit like we've seen the evolution of ticket machines in public transport. They've become less and less critical. And I know there are still a very big focus on the charge point, and they are changing for good reason. But the reality is that for drivers, when you start to think about the driver's convenience and the ease of use of the driver, you start to look at the mechanisms, the systems, and the back office behind supporting the charge points, and the ability to deliver data out of that whole network. So where we are today is that there are systems that can be focused around the usage of one driver. We're looking at systems that will connect the charging usage, not just on the network to which the driver might be familiar, either through his home charge point or at work, but one in which he may have a roaming agreement, and there are increasingly with companies like Franklin and others, roaming agreements which allow drivers to utilize those networks that are part of the roaming agreement, not just in the UK, but on continental Europe as well. And that's been a very important part of helping to increase the confidence of people to use electric vehicles. It also allows us to operate, as it were, a driver's account, so that the driver can consolidate all his charging usage and see how that is going. And in some cases, we're looking at situations where you might connect that driver's account, not just to the EV charging, but it could be connected to his home energy account, or if you're a fleet operator, to consolidating all of the power usage by your commercial vehicle fleet, as opposed to at the moment, every time your driver goes and uses a charge point in whatever, even if he's got use of various networks, you'll get separate bills, which is just going to make a nightmare of the whole thing. From my perspective also, I can see a situation where that information about what a driver is doing can also be matched to the driver's transport usage. So you may have heard about mobility as a service and the ability to consolidate, whether it's a subscription model or a pay-as-you-go model, where you can utilize a whole range of different modes. So having a system behind your charging infrastructure that is open and allows that connection to be made means that you can look at seriously taking your EV to the transport hub, be it a tram or a train or a bus, and then, or even a ferry, and then the use that you make of that transport network connected with your EV network may enable some marketing material to be sent to you if you want it, or indeed to look at incentives based on the fact that you're using a much more environmentally friendly method of transport. So those are the sort of things that we're looking forward to at the moment, and they're the reason why I think that a lot of the myths that we've had in the past, which are still circulating and will take time to get some understanding, will lead to significant driver changes in their behavior as soon as they start to get used to using EVs. I know from talking to people who have EVs that behavior change is quite rapid, simply because of the way that those vehicles will work and the intelligence in those vehicles. I'm sure some of you can remember the change from leaded to unleaded petrol, and the scare stories and the things that have happened with those cars and all the drama around catalytic converters and that sort of thing. And I think but very rapidly people got used to the idea and understood, albeit it took a couple of years, but they understood why it was necessary to move. And I think this is another one of those tipping points that we're reaching. Just to sum up, I think the future is extremely exciting. I do not believe that we are in a VHS versus Betamax, because I think the way we are, we can absorb and work with all types of technology at the front end, which will reflect the changes in automobile engineering, particularly around EVs, and the fact that your car, you may not even be involved in the transaction because the intelligence in your vehicle will communicate with the charge point, and the system will then pick up who you are and route the charging information, the payment information accordingly. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thanks, David. I asked David to send me a list of myths I put together, so I've got a big long list here. We're going to be going through that a little bit later, aren't we? The questions have started coming on Slido. Thank you very much. So again, the hashtag, if you haven't got it, HWYSUK, and we'll come to that after we've all finished chatting. But Laura, if you'd like to have your go.
Thank you. So yep, I'm Laura Rainey. I work for National Grid. Thank you, David, for organising the session today and inviting us along. Just a quick recap on who National Grid is and who I represent. There are a couple of different parts of National Grid within the UK. It's a UK-US business. I work and represent National Grid Electricity Transmission. So they own the high voltage kind of backbone electricity system within England and Wales. There is another legally separate part of the business, which is called the Electricity System Operator. And they will traditionally be the people you might think of as keeping the lights on, operating the electricity system on a minute-by-minute basis. I won't be speaking for those, for that group, but I can give a bit of an insight from an industry perspective into some of the issues that might be relevant there. When I was asked to come and speak about myths, I do get asked these questions quite a bit. And as soon as I started Googling, I was reminded around, the scale of different questions that are asked, different perspectives that are out there. So hopefully I can sort of demystify a few areas today. I've got two main things that I wanted to talk about to start with. One of the myths that I see kind of coming up again is on the basis of can the grid cope? And you'll see throughout my presentation and my discussion that the answer is yes, the grid can cope. But one kind of question that often gets raised is, if we all go and buy an EV tomorrow or next year, we don't have enough generation on the system, surely, to deal with that. And I guess my response to that would be, this is essentially a planning exercise like the energy industry does with a lot of different areas. The reality is people aren't going to go and everybody convert to an EV in the next year, but we know through government incentives and government policy that out to 2040, petrol and diesel cars and vans at that point will no longer be sold in the UK, and we will see a transition out to 2040 from petrol, diesel vans and cars over to electric and other zero-emission fuels. The transition that we're going to go through, the way that the energy sector, I'm sure, as the highways industry deals with this, is through scenario planning. And this is something that the industry's worked on for many years now. One of the scenarios that's often referenced is something called the future energy scenarios, and a lot of industry planning is done off that. And they've looked out to 2050 to see actually how much peak generation does the system need to support and enable the electrification of cars and vans. And the range of scenarios that are out there at the moment show about a 10 to 30% increase in peak generation, which when we're talking about over the next 30 years, that's a challenge that industry will rise to, and it's all part of the kind of scenario planning and industry infrastructure development for the next 30 years. So ultimately, on that point, the engineering systems exist. Where we are as an energy industry at the moment is making sure that we're delivering the most cost-effective and timely infrastructure to enable this transition. The second kind of myth I wanted to bust today, I've seen this a couple of times. So, if we're all going to start charging at home at the same time, can the grid cope? Is that going to crash the grid? And again, my answer to that would be, the engineering solutions exist. This is all about understanding what are we planning for and making sure that's delivered in a cost-effective way. So I think David picked up on this earlier. Great example at the weekend with the England-South Africa rugby game. What the system is not planning for is 30 million kettles to all turn on at once. But it is expected that a number of kettles, an unusual amount, will be turned on at half-time. It was around the equivalent of around 700,000 kettles going on within the interval. And the grid and the energy system as a whole will plan for that and will deliver. So on that note, and on the note of how do we help deliver enabling infrastructure in this cost-effective way, one of the big areas of development and innovation in the sector at the moment is around the concept of smart charging, of being able to enable you to charge your car at the lowest cost. And one of the really interesting areas, and one of the areas that you should see as a car owner there, is if you have a driveway, today you would maybe go home, plug in when you get in the evening, and you may or may not start charging there at the moment. But there is a lot of work going on in the industry, a lot of really great propositions being developed to essentially, there's two options. Either you can choose when you want to charge, and you can see what the cost of that is and charge with your preference. Or you might be able to say, well, I actually want this % of charge, or I want to be able to do this journey tomorrow. And everything beyond that is managed by either the energy industry, participants, or somebody, say your car manufacturer or lease company. So actually, there's an incredible amount of new opportunities that are being seen by the energy sector to make sure that the energy networks and systems are balanced, both in the short and the long term. I guess what David alluded to earlier was, this is a big transition, and with any transition, we do see certain challenges. So rather than just focus on the myths today, I also wanted to talk through what we see some of the really interesting challenges are, and how we as an energy sector are dealing with them. So the first one is around capacity in very localized areas. So what I mean by that is our first thought around EVs being deployed in the UK might be that they're all going to be evenly scattered around the country for the next 5 years. But actually what the infrastructure community expects, that is, for certain houses and certain streets, they will have a natural preference to buy an EV because they'll have a certain amount of cars, or because they have a driveway, do certain mileage, certain sort of suburb commuter style that will suit an EV. And this has been something that the sector's been aware of for many years, and has been working on how to create infrastructure in the right places at the right time. So that balance between not investing too early, but making sure that the capacity is there as and when people need it to charge their EVs. And it's fair to say there's a huge amount of innovation work going on in this space, spanning from new commercials and new contracts. So what I mean there is around, at the moment, many households and many companies are used to being able to use a certain amount of energy 24 hours a day. Some of these contracts might say, actually, you'll be charging at night and provide capacity and provide services that are much cheaper than charging throughout the whole day. The second thing that's being looked at is actually around the upgrades themselves. So making sure and using scenarios to understand where these clusters of new EVs are going to occur, and making sure that the right infrastructure is in the right timeframes. One particular example of this localized charging capacity is around ultra-rapid charging hubs. So this is something that I've been involved in with National Grid for about 12 to 18 months now. Ultimately, what we see the challenge being, for EVs up to now, they have, for many people, been used as the second car, the runaround. But to reach mass market, EVs will be the first car. They will be doing long mileage, and this is something that's supported by the new benefit in kind taxation schemes for company cars. So we're expecting to see more long distance journeys being done in EVs over the next 12 months onwards. And what it's fair to say when we've gone out and spoken with companies, drivers, read the research, is that drivers to convert to EVs are expecting a similar, if not better, charging experience than they have today whilst doing those electric miles. So whilst people will be charging at home, new opportunities to charge at work, at the gym, etc., on those long journeys, you will need to recharge en route, essentially. And when you look at what that looks like today, we've got quite a way to go in terms of the development of those rapid charging hubs. So at the moment, my colleague went out and he did a journey from Wokingham to Teesside and charging on the 120 kilowatt network, which is sort of the fastest commonplace network in the UK to date. It would have taken over 2 hours it did take over 2 hours to charge and complete that journey. We are not expecting that going forwards. The solutions are being developed. We're seeing much higher capacity charging coming in to enable these long distance journeys and mass market. But one thing National Grid Electricity Transmission did as a company was to really look at what does this charging network look like in the future, what needs to be developed from the energy sector perspective, and who should we be talking in terms of the wider sector, so talking with vehicle manufacturers and also talking with highways and the transport sector. And what we found there was that when we did a mapping exercise with only 54 sites, so 54 service stations across England and Wales, you could essentially create confidence and coverage for EV drivers across England and Wales, such that on the strategic road network, wherever you drove, within 50 miles, you would know that you would hit a high charging rapid hub and be able to refuel and go on your way. We've been working with the sector to not only understand what this technically looks like, but to understand how this can be developed, what's being done by the private sector already, where can industry, other industries participants support these activities. And we're currently in a state now where we're working with the rest of the industry, with policymakers, to understand how these solutions and how we deploy the networks in a timely and fit-for-purpose way to enable these rapid charging hubs and to enable these long-distance journeys. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of coverage around, some of the myths we see, why maybe they make a great headline, but they don't really reflect where the energy sector is at the moment and all the great work that's going on. But as I say, there are some challenges, manageable challenges. The engineering solutions exist, but we are in an active period at the moment as an energy industry, making sure that those solutions are developed in the next 2 to 3 years to enable this mass vehicle uptake. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That's really reassuring because, like you say, it's very at odds with some of the stuff I read about, which I'll ask you about later, actually. It suggests we can't do a deal over a nuclear power station and there's an energy crisis coming and all the rest of it. So anyway, Philip.
Great, thank you. So yeah, Philip New, I'm the CEO of an organization called the Energy Systems Catapult. There are 9 catapults across the country at the moment. My one is involved with, the mission effectively is to help British industry maximize the benefit, the economic benefit that is potentially available to it as we transition to a zero carbon future world. But in my capacity as the Energy Systems Catapult CEO, I've been asked to chair something called the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force, which was set up at the behest of government just over a year ago, and were it not for the looming election and PERDA would have been on the cusp of publishing its report. The first thing to say is that for the first time, we think, there's been an effort to engage stakeholders from multiple silos, multiple sectors of the economy. So this is a truly sort of significant attempt to embrace anyone and everyone who has got some skin in the game when it comes to this transition. Maybe it's not been quite as complete as we would like, but I think that, and this is certainly not an exclusive list, but it has meant trying to broker between the interests of data companies, of car companies, of energy companies, of local authorities, of infrastructure providers, and retailers, both traditional and new generation, to come up with a set of recommendations to enable the UK energy system to be absolutely fit for the widespread adoption of EVs. To try and pull this group together, we recognize that we needed to have some principles that we could adopt in the event of there being different interests that were colliding and proving very, very difficult to mediate. The first thing to say, of course, is the context, the strategic context, is very much set initially by the government's Road to Zero plan, which Laura's just referenced. Road to Zero said that from 2040 onwards, we can't buy a pure internal combustion engine car. Since then, I think the game has been completely changed by the Committee on Climate Change coming out with the view that we have to get to net zero, which was adopted by government and written into legislation under the Climate Change Act earlier this year. So we are now legally committed to net zero. This changes the game in many areas, but for transport, what it means is zero means zero. By 2050, there cannot be a mile driven by any vehicle that is using an internal combustion engine car if we are to comply with this, because we've got so many other areas of the economy that are going to be really difficult to decarbonize, and we're going to need all sorts of negative emission, interesting workarounds to deal with those, that transport absolutely has to be zero carbon. What that means, if we can have no cars, no trucks, no nothing on the road that are using fossil fuels by 2050, is that we've got to bring forward probably the date at which they stop being sold. Right? If the average lifespan of a vehicle is 15 years or 12 to 15 years, then that would suggest that sometime in the 2030s, we need to make that transition away to complete electrification of everything sold. And incidentally, when I say zero, that means hybrids are out as well. This is pure BEV or pure fuel cell vehicle, and if there's some other interesting technology that is zero emission that emerges in that period, then that as well, right? That's what it means. It concentrates the mind wonderfully. The second principle that we adopted was that all the recommendations really need to, they're the North Star, right? The thing that we look to in making a decision about where the recommendation lands is this going to suit the EV driver? The view here is that if we don't come up with answers that make driving and using an EV as simple, as easy, as straightforward as possible, then we're going to create barriers to adoption. So if in doubt, the question was always, what's going to work best for the driver? What we've focused on are what are the barriers to this transition, systemic and otherwise, and what are the things that could be done to enable the transition. So it's very much looking at those underlying system interventions that can help things move forward. We took a whole system approach. We can't look at the electrification of transport in isolation. We are in the middle, or at the start, of a massive transformation of the whole way in which this economy functions and its energy is provided if we're going to conform to a net zero future. That means that we have to also think, for example, about how we decarbonize the way we heat our houses. That means we've got to get rid of all gas boilers, at least putting natural gas through the gas boiler. So that means that there are going to be many other parts of the economy that are going to be potentially electrified as well as transport. So in thinking about what needs to happen for transport, we need to think about what happens for the economy as a whole. The Committee on Climate Change's view, which my organization sort of supports, is that that feels like we're going to at least double the demand for electricity in our economy over the next 30 or so years. About half of the electricity we generate today is from zero or low carbon sources. The rest comes from predominantly natural gas. All that natural gas stuff has got to go. That means that we've got to treble the amount of renewable generation that we produce over the next 30 years. The good news is that the offshore wind industry and other sectors are leading the way, both in terms of cost and confidence of scale-up. And with the innovations that are being talked about from Laura in the grid, we're pretty confident that that doubling of capacity and transforming it entirely to be low carbon is doable. Not without challenges, but is doable. Future-proofing really speaks into the fact that we don't know what we don't know. AI is another trend that we think could be utterly transformative. What we've been very concerned about, therefore, is to try and ensure that whatever recommendations that we make aren't deterministic, don't lock us into any specific solution, but instead provide a frame within which new technologies, new innovations can be modeled and deployed as appropriate. As I say, we're creating a framework, and we're trying to put in place some common core standards to support as open a playing field as possible without being prescriptive about what solutions are, because there is so much uncertainty about what the future technologies will look like. Social and economic equity is critical. This plays at all levels, from how do we think about making sure that people who are fuel poor aren't subsidizing the delivery of great solutions to enable Tesla drivers to be a little bit more convenient, through to how do we think about the difference between those that are fortunate enough to have their own driveways, their own garages, and an ability to charge at home and potentially take advantage of smart tariffs, versus those that don't have access to that are going to be forced to use only public charging. So how do you start to think about those differences to ensure that we don't create a new set of inequities? And finally, there's the question of urgency. If we're now potentially looking at a world where we're actually going to complete the migration to a fully zero carbon transport system in the 2030s and early 2040s to conform with a net zero future, we've got to pull our finger out, right? We have really got to make sure that these changes are happening in the next 5 to 6 years, so that by the time the system and the country is heading into that 2030 period, we've got things pretty much sorted out, bottomed out, and the capability is in place. So the themes that are coming through the work, therefore, are, first of all, making sure that the system of the future is as interoperable as possible. That operates across, there are many forms of interoperability. To keep it simple, I can operate in sort of groups of 3. So the 3 areas that I'd be referring to here are transactional interoperability. So you can buy what you want, when you want it. Physical interoperability, so that you're not constrained because you've got the wrong plug, or there's some other physical barrier to you being able to charge your car. And data interoperability, so that information is shared across the system and between users, their cars, their homes, and their suppliers, so that the best outcomes can be developed. We need to make sure that consumers are able to charge smartly. If we don't get smart charging working, then the cost of getting the network infrastructure right is going to be greater. Getting smart charging working well means that we need to have tariffs that properly reward people for charging when it suits the grid best, when it suits our supply of electricity best. So we need to make sure that we've got that fixed. We need to be very thoughtful about what happens to data. Data is going to be it isn't going to be about the electrons, it's going to be about the data in this future world. And so making sure that data is used well, is shared well, is protected, and people have confidence in it is critical. If people are going to be comfortable about the transition to this future, well, there's a lot more work to do, to try and resolve some of the myths that are out there, win people's trust, win people's confidence, make sure that there are fair ways of being able to deal with complaints, make sure there are ways of providing people with information that they trust and can be confident about. And finally, we need to make sure that the infrastructure that is put in is the right infrastructure. There is more work that we need to do to improve our planning mechanisms, both at national and at local level. Improve our governance mechanisms that sit behind that. Make sure that we can invest as a society with confidence in the infrastructure that we need ahead of when we'll need it, rather than waiting for it to be done in a reactive way, because if it's done in a reactive way, guess what? We'll have brownouts. So we need to be able to do that with confidence. And finally, we need to make sure that we are supporting all of the people that are procuring, deploying, and then operating charge points, so that the reliability of those charge points is at a much higher standard than is the case today. There is no point in having lots of charge points if they're poorly maintained, there are poor standards, and they don't work when you rock up. So that's the essence of where the task force is going.
Great. Well, we're getting some really good questions in, which I'll go straight to after Ross, actually. Some of them about inequity, actually, and cost is obviously a big one that's coming through.